Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Today I think is going to finally be the day that we bust into this. This is clearly quite a large set of new watercolor paint, and it has been sitting under my desk tempting me for a couple of weeks now, but I've just been too busy working on other things to even consider looking at it. But now is finally the time to play around with this. So this is the Magello Mission Gold 34 set. It's very awkward to hold this up, so I'm just going to talk about it. I believe in a semi-recent video I talked about wanting to look at specifically some sort of watercolor paint that was less granulating than my typical Daniel Smith paint. Is what I'm normally using, and I just wanted to have like a set that I knew was all like not as granulating, and the Magello Mission Gold watercolors for whatever reason have always been a paint that have been very interested in trying out, and they are one of those, like, it seems to be a lot of Asian watercolor brands like the Holbein, the Shinhan, the Magello, which are Korean, I believe. For whatever reason, it just seems that more Asian watercolor brands do not make quite as granulating paints, or that's just like not the paint recipe that they're interested in. I don't know. I don't think they're necessarily advertised as like non-granulating paints. It's just the look of them is a lot smoother than a granulating paint looks like. This is like way too much over explanation for this concept. I'm sure you get it. But yeah, I was looking up the different reviews and pros and cons of the various less granulating paints that I was interested in looking at, and I decided that it was finally time to look at getting some Magello Mission Gold paints. Like I sort of mentioned, I think the plan is going to be to put these in some sort of palette. You know, I love to make palettes. It's just way more convenient and practical for me to pan them or do something like panning the paints than just use them from the tube. That's just my preference for how I like using watercolor paints. So we're gonna make some sort of palette, swatch them of course, and try them out with some sort of painting. I'm not sure if I mentioned, this is a 34 tube set of 15 milliliter tubes, and I quickly designed and made myself up this really simple palette. It's literally just a bunch of full pans like attached in this single thing, super simple lid that I may or may not actually paint or decorate eventually, but for now this is going to be what I put these paints in. I was debating whether I wanted them into like individual pans that I could move around, but I figured I'm probably only ever going to want to keep this set together, so I just decided to make this up. So it is 7 by 5 full pans, so technically this is a 35 palette, but 34 was just annoying to figure out a good situation, and I like how this is like really thin, so it'll be really easy to like put off to the side like how I normally like painting, because normally it's quite a thin space that I have over here to paint with. So having something long and thin palette wise is my preference for working, because it just makes the setup a lot easier. Without further ado, let's actually start getting some paint into this palette. The underside of the lid has the color names in the paint sets by region, and after reading this, I realized I actually have what they list to be the Asia set, which is fine by me because the colors in the Type A sets got rid of the white and black, which I don't use for watercolor anyway. In the box, there's also a pamphlet that showcases all 126 colors available in the line. There's also another smaller pamphlet with just general information, but underneath this fabric piece, there's of course all of the beautiful brand new watercolor tubes. There's also this elastic band tucked into the corner, which my best to guess for what this is for is to keep the box closed, but please let me know if you actually know what it's for. But now it's time to start getting this paint into this palette. The first thing that I noticed when I was beginning to fill up this pans was just how smooth and, for lack of a better term, liquidy the paint was. I don't mean that in like a bad way though. It was just going into these pans beautifully. It wasn't wasn't too chunky, it all seemed mixed well. There were definitely colors later on which you will see that were a bit thicker, and so I used a toothpick just to even those out in the pans. But my first impressions of these paints, just putting them into these palette sections, were that they were really nice and smooth, highly pigmented paint. So I was very excited to get a chance to start actually playing around with these with a paintbrush. I also was just putting them into the pans in the color order they were in the box, in case anyone was wondering. They seem to already be in color order, which makes sense given that this was like a pre-made set. So I didn't mess around with it, I just put them in one by one in terms of what order they were in from the box. And here's what my finished palette looked like. Now I let this sit for a couple of days just to let the tops of the pans firm up a little so that I didn't have like a gooey watercolor mess to deal with. But once those had dried up a little, it was time to start actually swatching them. So I made myself this swatch chart, which I will leave a link to, like a drive folder for it below for anyone else that might want to make their own. I just took a pre-existing Mission Gold paint swatch chart and removed all of the colors so that I could actually make real paint swatches, but I left all of the information. So it has, you know, the light fastness, the transparency level, the pigment information, and of course the actual name of the paint color. And this was printed out on actual watercolor paper. I just feed it through the back of my inkjet printer, and, you know, make sure you don't touch any of the ink with your wet brush or paint because the ink will generally run. But if you have like a back feeding printer, you tend to be able to very easily print on watercolor paper. I know I get a lot of questions about that when I make swatch charts. But enough about the chart itself, let's start talking about these paints. They were swatching so beautifully. They had exactly the type of non-granulating texture that I was looking for, so I was very excited. They were really just easy to blend out. I can't exactly remember what paper I was using. It wasn't like the fanciest watercolor paper, so I wasn't expecting like the smoothest gradient from the like full-blown color on the left side to the more sheared out version, but what they all did looked really, really nice. In terms of the entire set, I really love the color selections. It's something that I always like to mention when reviewing sets, because a lot of the time you get like an uneven balance of color, or I make recommendations as like, you know, I really wish that they would have replaced this color with something more like that. And for this set, I would say it's like 95% like the perfect balance of color. The only thing that I maybe would have done would be swap out like one of the greens, like the yellow green and the greenish yellow are pretty close colors. Even the sap green is a very similar color, so I could have seen doing without one of those and putting something else in the set. This particular set did not have a black. It is not something that I'm going to miss, but that could have been a color that they went with instead of one of those greens. Just wanted to mention I messed up this swatch chart in 2 places, but it is rectified here. So the Van Dyke Brown was not mixed properly in the pan, which I did fix, and then you can see like a much more clean and accurate swatch. And I'm not entirely sure what happened with the indigo. I think I accidentally went back into the Prussian blue and swatched that again, but this chart is accurate and fixed, so if you wanted to see like a pretty reasonably accurate representation of what these colors looked like, then here is my finished swatch chart. The swatch chart was really just like a first impressions test, and I really wanted to use these on an actual painting so that I could really get a feel for how they looked and performed. And of course my choice test was going to have to be some sort of portrait. I figured it just makes the most sense. There's probably like an 85% chance that these watercolors will be getting used for some sort of portrait work in the future, so it just seemed like the most realistic option. I did throw a bit of a surrealistic twist into this though to really put these to the test to the other thing that I'm generally the most known for painting, which is galaxies, but we will get to that later on in the painting. I just wanted to quickly mention that I actually uploaded a full-length real-time version of this painting on my channel, which I will card here and link below if you are interested in checking that out. I thought it might be educational to have the option of people being able to see how fast I actually paint, which, spoiler alert, is not this extremely sped up version. But back to the painting and my thoughts on this paint. I used a 100% cotton watercolor paper for this portrait. It's one of my favorite papers to use, so I figured it would be a good like test base because I know how it reacts to my typical watercolor paint, and so I'd really be able to tell exactly how the Mission Gold paint sort of held up to my Daniel Smith watercolors and just generally the watercolor paint that I am preferring to use. Because I don't actually think I've had a chance to mention this in the video yet, the set of Mission Gold paints is actually really reasonably priced in my opinion. It is considered artist quality paint. It has, you know, all of the fancy pigments in it, and the 34 set cost me less than 200 Canadian dollars, which puts it at around like $5-ish a tube, which is incredible. Like, you're not about to get Daniel Smith or Winsor Newton paints in the quantity that these tubes are. They're 15 milliliter tubes. They are like, Daniel Smith terms, I think that's like at least $15, so it's like 3 times the price for the same amount of paint that is supposed to essentially be the same quality of pigments and everything. I believe they also come in smaller sets, so I essentially bought like the most expensive set, so looking at the possibility of there being like a 12 or 24 set at an even lower price, I would put these paints at possibly being in that really nice sweet spot for the type of beginner watercolor artist that is wanting to upgrade beyond the, not even necessarily like student grade paints, well that too, but like the Crayola sort of level of watercolor paints. Just something that is a really nice level of quality but not incredibly expensive, which the smaller sets are going to be even less expensive. But even the 34 set at under 200 Canadian dollars for me is an incredibly reasonable price. Instead of sending somebody to looking at like a Winsor Newton Cotman type of set, which I don't know how easy those are to get anymore. I know that when I bought mine, they were quite difficult to sometimes find, and you know, you're also looking up there in price. So less than 200 for 34 like really large tubes of watercolor paint for the quality that it is, I think is incredible. Like, it's literally professional watercolor paint. Cotman is considered student grade, so it's not even like a one-to-one comparison. I just know that the Winsor Newton Cotman watercolors tend to be one of those paint brands that get thrown around a lot as like a good sort of midpoint upgrade before you are starting to look at like the legitimate, incredibly expensive pigment paints. So for me right now, this is by far my like winning watercolor brand for beginners that are looking to upgrade the quality of their paints, because I really loved how these paints worked. Like, there was nothing that made me feel like I wasn't using my most expensive paints, other than maybe noticing, you know, that they're not as granulating, which for me was not like a downgrade. That is why I bought these paints. The colors in the set, like I mentioned, are incredibly well balanced, so I had no difficulty, or there was no like snags in my workflow, because if you've seen my typical watercolor palette, you know that I have a ton of paint colors in it, and so mixing up the colors that I needed to create more natural, neutral portrait colors that I'm more used to using in my normal palette was not an issue, because it has a really nice range of the different colors within the palette, so mixing it up was not a problem. And I know, looking at the idea of possibly buying a set like this for somebody, you're not going to have to worry that the colors in it aren't like a good range. So like someone that has no idea about watercolor paint, if you were buying somebody this set, you're good to go. Like, the set itself is perfect as is. They're going to be all ready to paint with the colors available in it. And yeah, I think that's about it. I clearly really love these watercolor paints. I think they perform just as well as professional watercolors, 3 times their price. I definitely think that these paints are going to be living on my desk and getting used a lot because they just work really beautifully and smoothly. They layer up really well. So I think that whether you're someone that is looking at upgrading their current watercolor paints to something more professional, or someone that already has maybe quite a few different professional watercolor paints, I think that the Magello Mission Gold watercolors could have a place in both of your paint collections. But that is everything, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.